Hi guys, welcome to the video lecturing sessions. In our regular classes, we have studied about the female reproductive system. Today, let me explain to you the structure of human ovary. As we know that ovaries are a pair of oval, almond-shaped structures. They are the primary sex organs located on either side of the uterus and attached to the wall of the uterus by the ligament that is called as ovarian ligament, and attached to the body wall by mesoovarium. Now this single ovary, if you take up, it's about 2 to 4 centimeter long and around 3 centimeter wide and 1 to 2 centimeter in thickness. And if you take up the section of the ovary, yes, as we see here, now we see that there the outermost layer of the ovary, that is the germinal epithelium, made up of the cuboidal epithelial cells that covers the ovary from the outside, and inside the interior of the ovary, human ovary, is divided into two parts. The central one is the medulla and the peripheral, the surrounding one, is the cortex. As we see in the medulla, there are blood vessels entering into the ovary in the medulla region. So that means medulla region is richly supplied with the blood vessels, nerves, and there is also connective tissue. Now as we see here, this is the blue colored one is the vein and the red colored one is the artery entering into the medulla of the ovary. And the ovary as such, as we see here, is attached to the outer wall of the uterus by a ligament that is called as the ovarian ligament. Ovarian ligament. Now let us look at the cortex. The cortex region, which is important part of the ovary, where we find the ovarian follicles. What you see here, circular structures, these all are ovarian follicles. And two of them are labeled here, antral follicles and Graafian follicles. Graafian follicle is the largest one and fully grown ovarian follicle, and the other follicles, which are smaller one, are growing ovarian follicle. We'll take up the different types of follicles down there. Let's see what are the other structures. Here you find a small structure round, which is the atretic follicle, that is the ovarian follicle which has degenerated. Most of the ovarian follicle actually undergo degeneration, and very few actually reach the stage of the Graafian follicle and then ovulate. Ovulation means release of the oocyte or the egg. So throughout the reproductive life of a woman, around 400 ova or the oocytes are ovulated, and out of the 60 to 80,000 ovarian follicles, only these are the few which are actually reaching the Graafian follicle and ovulating. All other will be degenerating. Now the material in between all these ovarian follicles is the connective tissue, which is consisting of the connective tissue, stroma, in which we find collagen fibers, elastin fibers, and the fibroblasts, etc. which hold all the structures of the ovary together. And here you see that the Graafian follicle is in the process of ovulation or already ovulated. So we can label it as ovulated follicle. So what you see here is the oocyte, secondary oocyte, because in humans egg or ovum is formed only at the time of fertilization. So till then it will be in secondary oocyte stage. So that is released here along with the granulosa cells surrounding it, that is called as a cumulus oophorus. So this is how the ovulation or release of the oocyte takes place, and then the egg will be, the released oocyte or the egg will be taken up by the oviducal funnel with the help of the fimbriae. So these fimbriae have got the ciliated lining, and with the beating of the cilia, the oocyte is made to enter into the fallopian tube. And as we know that this enlarged funnel-like structure, oviducal funnel, or it is also called as infundibulum. Okay, now let's take up the other structures. The yellow colored body, what we see there, that is called as a corpus luteum, and this is formed after the ovulation. The ovulated mass of the follicle, the remaining cells of the follicle, under the stimulus of or under the action of LH hormone, luteinizing hormone, it gets converted into a yellow colored body. Therefore it is called as corpus luteum. Luteum refers to yellow body. So corpus luteum itself means yellow body. Luteum is yellow. So this is a gland, endocrine gland, which is responsible for secretion of the progesterone, which is important for maintaining the pregnancy. And if there is no pregnancy, no fertilization of the egg, then what happens is this corpus luteum shrinks and it forms a corpus albicans, which is also degenerated corpus luteum. So now let us take up the different types of ovarian follicle which are drawn here. I have made the drawings down there for each of this. Now look at these different follicles. The smallest one, which is having the oocyte in the center, surrounded by just one layer of, a single layer of granulosa cells, as we see here, granulosa cells. That forms the single covering around the oocyte, and this is what the first stage of the ovarian follicle called as primary follicle. And this primary follicle later on changes into secondary follicle, and what we see is the number of layers of the granulosa layers around it go on increasing. Okay, so it becomes surrounded by many layers of granulosa cells. So that is secondary follicle. Then this secondary follicle further develops into tertiary or antral follicle, it is called as. What happens is, as the number of the granulosa cells go on increasing and the follicle becomes larger and larger, some of the granulosa cells inside in the center degenerate and create a cavity filled with a liquid, as we see here. So this is called as a antral cavity, and it is filled with antral fluid, and that's why the tertiary follicle is also called as antral follicle. Now this antral follicle ultimately develops into it develops into the Graafian follicle, the mature follicle we call. The mature follicle, fully grown up ovarian follicle or mature follicle is called as the Graafian follicle. Now look at the structure of Graafian follicle. The secondary oocyte is at the center. Secondary oocyte is at the center, surrounded by a area which is clear and which is non-cellular layer, which is called as the. So we are looking at this white area just around the oocyte. This can be labeled as zona pellucida. That's the non-cellular layer just surrounding the secondary oocyte. And next to it there is a layer of the granulosa cells only, arranged in radiating fashion, and that forms the corona radiata. Corona radiata. Let us mark it. This layer, which is showing the cells arranged in radial fashion, that is called as the corona radiata. Okay, and now that is about the structure of the oocyte surrounded with these layers. Outside the corona radiata there is a layer of the granulosa cells surrounding it, forming a disc-like structure, and these cells again continue in the form of a cord connecting it to the wall of the Graafian follicle, and this structure is therefore called as cumulus oophorus. Cumulus oophorus. Okay. Now you notice here one thing, that this oocyte is situated exactly in the center of the Graafian follicle, okay, and surrounded by a fluid filled cavity, and that's the same cavity, antral cavity or antrum we call, and which is filled with antral fluid. Antral fluid. Now the wall of the Graafian follicle is made up of again 3 layers. The innermost is the granulosa layer, this red colored cells what I have drawn. This layer continues like this. Then the middle one and the outermost one, these two are called as the thecal layers. The middle one is theca interna, I will label here this one, theca interna, and the outermost is theca externa. There is a slight difference in the types of cells present there. Theca interna, you see that the cells are a little larger and oval in shape and have the very thin cell membrane, and in theca externa the cells are highly flattened, as you see there, highly flattened cells in many layers forming the outermost layer or outermost covering of the Graafian follicle. Okay, so this is the structure of Graafian follicle, fully mature ovarian follicle it is. Now this Graafian follicle only ovulates or releases the oocyte on tentatively 14th day of the menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle, we are going to study about that. It is the cyclic changes which are taking place. It's about the cyclic changes which are taking place in the uterus, inner lining of the uterus, that is called as the endometrium, as well as in the ovary, which are again controlled by the hormones. Endocrine regulation is there. So that cycle repeats every 28 days in a mature human female. So that is what called as the menstrual cycle, and it's the 14th day, that is on the mid-cycle day. Normally ovulation occurs, though it may be 2 days earlier or 2 days later, but that's the period when the Graafian follicle ovulates. The wall of the Graafian follicle fuses with the wall of the or outermost covering of the ovary, and the oocyte along with the cumulus oophorus is released out. So that's called as the ovulation. Now that's about the structure of the ovary and different follicles we have seen, ovarian follicles. Now let us look into another structure, that's yellow body, called as the corpus luteum. This is the corpus luteum in section, and this structure is formed, as I have told you, from the remaining cells and tissues of the already ovulated follicle, Graafian follicle, and that under the influence of luteinizing hormone, it becomes a endocrine gland called as corpus luteum, and we can see there the cells are radiatingly arranged. These are the cells of the, or you can say glandular cells of the corpus luteum is serving as the endocrine gland, as I have told you, and this gland is formed after the ovulation. And why this gland is formed? It is because if the fertilization takes place and the embryo attaches to the wall of the uterus, that is implantation we call. When the implantation takes place, the attached embryo, or the very first structure which goes and binds with the endometrium, is called as the blastocyst. So when it attaches to the wall of the uterus, there are ample chances that it may be expelled out, because the wall of the uterus has got another layer, as you have studied, that is myometrium, and the smooth muscles in the myometrium, they go on contracting continuously in normal case, in all along the cycle till the 14th day and a little later also. But once the corpus luteum is formed and it starts secretion of the progesterone, the hormone is known as progesterone. Actually, corpus luteum is found to produce progesterone as well as one more hormone called as inhibin, which will stop the release of FSH when it is not needed. Okay, and this progesterone is responsible for, and not only that, the corpus luteum is also found to release relaxin. Relaxin is a hormone which is needed at the time of parturition, that is at the time of delivery. of the child. So this will bring about the relaxation of the muscles in the cervix and the vagina, so that the birth canal is made, and also you know that the pubic symphysis, which is the joining of the two pubic bones in front, pubic bones, and in between them there is a ligament, and that will be loosened by the effect of relaxin, so that the two half parts of the pelvic girdle will move away a little bit, and the birth canal is widened. So that is how the relaxin is functioning, and that also comes from the corpus luteum, that is just prior to the parturition or delivery of the child. Otherwise, progesterone is the main hormone produced from the corpus luteum, and this progesterone is anti-myometric hormone. So what is the meaning of anti-myometric? Wherever myo word comes, we know that it is related to the muscle. So it is anti means against the muscular contractions in the wall of the uterus. It will stop the contractions of the wall of the uterus, so that the attached early embryo or blastocyst is retained there and it will not be expelled out. So the wall of the uterus becomes static, and that is the function carried out by the progesterone. In normal menstrual cycle, when the woman is not pregnant, after the 21st day of the menstrual cycle, the progesterone will be withdrawn. And remember, one more important function of the progesterone is to maintain the healthy endometrium, thick endometrium, which has to be maintained, which is needed for implantation or attachment of the embryo. So it also maintains that healthy endometrium. And after 21st day of the menstrual cycle also, if there is no implantation, that means there has been no fertilization. So what happens is the corpus luteum shrinks and progesterone is withdrawn. The release of the progesterone will be stopped. So then we see that the contractions in the uterus once again begins, and the wall of the endometrium, that is the inner wall of the uterus endometrium, breaks up, and as menses, the broken pieces of the endometrium and blood will be sent out during the menstrual cycle in first 5 days of the next menstrual cycle. That is, we are going to take up detailed information about the menstrual cycle and its hormonal regulation in our next lecture. So today, dear students, remember about whatever we have just learnt. We have seen that a pair of ovaries are there, which are the primary sex organs in female, or the female gonads, which are responsible for production of the female gamete. And we have seen the internal structure of the ovary, which is divided into medulla and the cortex. Medulla supplies the nutrients, oxygen, and the other necessary minerals and all to the cells of the, or all the living tissues of the ovary. So nervous supply is also there, as well as the blood circulation at the medulla region. And cortex is one where we have seen that ovarian follicles are there in different stage of the growth and development. There are about 60 to 80,000 ovarian follicles, primary ovarian follicles, which will be slowly growing into the mature follicle, but as I told you, only 400 will be able to reach the follicle, the mature follicle stage, that is the Graafian follicle stage, and ovulate. Now we have seen the structure of these different follicles and how the gradual development takes place. Remember that the wall of the Graafian follicle is also working as the endocrine gland. It produces another female sex hormone called as estrogen, which is needed for maintenance of secondary sexual characters in the female. What are the secondary sexual characters in the female? That is maintaining the menstrual cycle, growth and development of the mammary glands, thick scalp hair, growth of the body hair, enlargement of the breasts, and deposition of the fat below the skin. Okay, and these developments which take place just after the puberty, those are all regulated and maintained by the estrogen. Then we have seen another endocrine gland, that is Corpus Luteum, formed with the influence of LH, luteinizing hormone, and this is responsible for secretion of mainly progesterone, relaxin, and according to some authors, even some amount of inhibin is also being released from corpus luteum. And progesterone is therefore called as anti-myometric hormone, which keeps the wall of the uterus static, don't allow it to undergo contractions. Okay, that's why it is anti-myometric, and therefore we say that corpus luteum helps in maintaining the pregnancy through the important hormone called as progesterone. Now let us summarize whatever we have learnt about the structure of human ovary. I have listed some points here. Let's go through. You can also note down these points. Ovaries are female gonads, as we know. They are the female gonads and also primary sex organs. Gonads are the organs which produce the gamete. So female gonads, ovaries, produce the female gametes called as the eggs or ova, and we call it as the primary sex organ because it is responsible for production of the female gametes, and it also serves as endocrine gland. It also serves as endocrine gland because the ovary produces sex hormones, female sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone. So these are steroid hormones, sex hormones. Then a pair of ovaries are located on either side of uterus in lower abdomen, attached to the wall of the uterus by ligament, as we know, that is ovarian ligament, and to the wall of the body cavity the ovaries are attached with the help of another broad ligament which is a connective tissue sheath like structure, and that is called as meso-ovarium. Okay, now let's take up the next point. Then ovaries are mesodermal in origin. Ovaries are mesodermal in origin. What does it mean? They are derived from the mesoderm during the embryonic growth and development. So mesodermal in origin. Ovaries are almond shaped structures, as we see here. This is the almond, as you see. So almond shaped almond shaped in structure. Now let us take up the size of the ovary. Usually we know that it is 2 to 4 centimeter long, but if you take up an average size of the human ovary, that will be about 3.5 centimeter in length, then 2.5 centimeter in width, and 1.5 centimeter in thickness. That is the average size of human ovary. Now, ovary is covered by a layer of cuboidal epithelium. It is covered by cuboidal epithelium that we call it as germinal epithelium. Let's say its position, its location in the diagram. Yes, this one. This is the cuboidal epithelium, germinal epithelium, that continues and covers the ovary externally. And these germinal epithelial cells only undergo mitotic cell division, increase their number, and those excess cells which are produced, they descend down and they only surround the oocytes, forming the ovarian follicles. Okay, so that is the germinal epithelium. Now, internally ovary is divided into two zones. What are those? We have discussed. One is the central medulla region and the outer cortex. In the medulla region, we have seen that there are blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves entering. So we see here, this is the medulla region, and we see that the vein, that blue colored, and red colored one, artery, and also lymph vessels enter into this region. There is a connective tissue over here, and it is also supplied with the nerves. Now this serves important function of providing the nutrients to the tissues and cells of the ovary. And the another region, that's the remaining part of the ovary, we call it as the cortex. This is the cortex. From here to here also it is the cortex. So in the cortex we find that there are the growing ovarian follicles. Okay, so that is called as the cortex, and there is a connective tissue stroma also, which keeps all these held together. Right? Now let us take up the other points. So we already discussed medulla is supplied with the blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves, and cortex contains the ovarian follicles, which are in a different stage of development. How many types of ovarian follicles are there? We see that there are usually 4 types: primary ovarian follicles, secondary ovarian follicles, tertiary or antral ovarian follicles, and Graafian follicles. Okay, and at the time of puberty we see that there are about 60,000 to 80,000 primary follicles in a single ovary, and out of which we have learned that only 400 actually reach the Graafian stage, Graafian follicular stage, and then ovulate. Why very less number compared to the number of ovarian follicle present are ovulated? It's because every month only one secondary oocyte will be released from the ovary. So that means every month only one egg is formed. So if you see the reproductive period of the human female, the phase of the reproductive life, how many years available right from the puberty till the end of the reproductive age, and you count the number of months, and that will be approximately more or less 400. So that's how only 400 oocytes can actually ovulate. Remaining all follicles will be just undergoing, what is that process? Degeneration, forming the atretic follicles. Okay, now let us take up the next point. Primary follicles. If you take up the primary follicle, it has one oocyte which is surrounded by a single layer of follicular cells, or what we call granulosa cells. From where these cells are coming? Yes, from the germinal epithelium that surround the oocyte. So if a single layer is there, that is primary follicle, and then when the layer of the granulosa cells increase and they form many layers, the follicle turns into secondary follicle. So the next stage of follicular growth it is. Then it changes into, or it develops into the tertiary follicle, which is larger, and it has got many more layers of the granulosa cells. Okay, so like this tertiary follicle is formed. Tertiary follicle is also called as the antral follicle because it has got a fluid filled cavity known as antrum. Okay, then let us take up the other points. Graafian follicle, let us know about Graafian follicle little bit in detail. Already we have discussed through these points. Let's go through. Graafian follicle is the fully grown ovarian follicle or mature ovarian follicle which is ready to ovulate or release the oocyte. Okay, it is more or less centrally located oocyte. It has, this follicle has more or less centrally located oocyte, and then this oocyte is connected to the wall of the Graafian follicle by cumulus oophorus. Let us look into the picture once again. Yes, so this is the Graafian follicle, what we see here. Now, as you see here, this is the centrally, more or less centrally located oocyte. Secondary oocyte we call it. Then surrounding the oocyte, immediately there is a zona pellucida, then corona radiata, and then the granulosa layer. So this granulosa layer which you see here surrounding it like a disc and continuing down as a cord of cells and connecting to the wall of the Graafian follicle. So this is what called as cumulus oophorus. This is known as cumulus oophorus. Cumulus oophorus, right? And then, by the way, let us know about the wall of the Graafian follicle. As you see here, the outermost layer has flattened cells. The middle one has got more or less oval, thin membraned cells. The outer one is called as theca externa, and the inner one, or the middle layer of the wall, is called as the theca interna. Outer one is theca externa, inner one is theca interna, and then the innermost layer is granulosa. Innermost layer is granulosa layer. So this is granulosa layer. We have also noted that the wall of the Graafian follicle is also working as endocrine gland, as it produces estrogen, female sex hormone. Now let's go back to the points which we are discussing here. Then we have seen the three layers of the Graafian follicle: granulosa cells, then theca interna and theca externa, and we also see that the wall of the Graafian follicle is responsible for secretion of estrogen, which is responsible for maintaining secondary sexual characters in female. Okay. Now there is also cavity, antral cavity or antrum, which is filled with antral fluid that we have seen, that surrounds the oocyte. When the Graafian follicle ovulates, the leftover follicles or leftover follicle, that is the tissues and the cells which are remaining there in the Graafian follicle, that will be converted into endocrine gland called as corpus luteum. It's a temporary endocrine gland, corpus luteum, which is formed under the influence of LH, luteinizing hormone. Now, yes, luteinizing hormone is responsible for that, as we have seen. Now let us take up something about the corpus luteum, the yellow body which is formed after the ovulation, which secretes mainly three hormones: progesterone, inhibin, and relaxin. So these are the three hormones which are secreted by the corpus luteum. And we also noted that the progesterone is the anti-myometric hormone that keeps the wall of the uterus static, don't allow the muscles to undergo contraction, so that the pregnancy is maintained. Okay, let's have a look at the corpus luteum once again. Yes, this is what the corpus luteum we are seeing here, which contains the glandular cells which are arranged in a particular radial manner inside, and this corpus luteum is responsible for production of those three different hormones. Now we know the function of the progesterone, and we have also learned about the functions of the inhibin and relaxin. As I told you, inhibin, it stops the release of the FSH, and relaxin help in widening the birth canal at the time of childbirth. Remember these points. And then going to the next point, if there is no fertilization of ovulated egg and pregnancy, there is no pregnancy and no fertilization, then what happens? The corpus luteum shrinks, and due to shrinkage of the corpus luteum, progesterone is withdrawn, that is, progesterone secretion stops, and the corpus luteum changes into corpus albicans. And this has a very strong effect on the wall of the uterus. The myometrium starts contracting again, and the build-up of the endometrium, that whole tissue lining inside the uterus, that endometrium starts breaking up, right? And that itself comes out with the blood as the menses or bleeding during the menstrual cycles. We are going to study about it later on. Now, other type of the follicles you find, of course, this you should remember that the shrunken corpus luteum, okay, that forms what? Corpus albicans, and that is the degenerated corpus luteum. Similarly, degenerated ovarian follicles, they are called as atretic follicle. Formation of atretic follicle is happening regularly because in 1 month only one ovarian follicle can grow, reach the stage of Graafian follicle and ovulate. So the other ovarian follicle which are growing, they will be arrested, their growth will be arrested. Some chemicals released from the Graafian follicle will inhibit the other Graafian follicle from further growing, and those follicles undergo degeneration and they form the atretic follicles. They form atretic follicle. Okay, and as the woman becomes older and older, because of the number of the corpus albicans which form the scar in the ovary, and also the atretic follicle which are also appearing like scar, it will be full of these structures. So with this we conclude the study on the structure of human ovary. In our next lecture, in our next video lecture, I will take up the menstrual cycle. Till then, bye.